For years, much of the evidence gathered by investigators, interviews, emails, logs, and more, was sealed under court orders. Victims argued this secrecy protected powerful people and blocked justice.
For years, much of the evidence collected by investigators, interviews, emails, logs, and other material remained sealed under court orders. Survivors and victims argued that this secrecy did not serve justice. Instead, it shielded powerful individuals and obstructed accountability. The year 2019 may have marked the end of Jeffrey Epstein's life, but it was only the beginning of the far larger collapse of everything he had built and everything he may have left behind. Within just 2 days of his death, the FBI arrived on Little St. James. At the time, the public was not told exactly what had been seized, recovered, or uncovered there. And that silence only deepened the island's already sinister reputation. For nearly 2 decades, Little St. James had been presented to the world as an astonishingly beautiful private retreat, a sunlit Caribbean sanctuary owned by financier Jeffrey Epstein and visited by some of the most influential people on Earth. But beneath that polished image, according to survivor testimony, legal filings, and years of speculation, lay something far darker. Then, in August 2019, the FBI tore through that illusion. Agents descended on the island, and what they appeared to find seemed even more disturbing than the most persistent rumors had suggested. Legal filings submitted by attorneys for survivors repeatedly identified Little St. James as one of the primary locations where Epstein's crimes were carried out. This was not a paradise. According to those accounts, it was a cold, calculated machine, a place whose very geography and architecture may have been shaped to facilitate some of the most horrific abuses of the modern age. What follows is an examination of Epstein's Island, a place that, for 2 decades, functioned as a self-made billionaire's private playground, built on unspeakable exploitation. In 1998, Jeffrey Epstein, then an increasingly prominent financier based in New York, purchased Little St. James in the United States Virgin Islands for roughly $8 million. At the time, the acquisition drew little attention. In the era of booming financial markets and exploding wealth, privacy had become one of the most prized luxuries on Earth, and owning a private island was perhaps the ultimate symbol of that privilege. Property records showed that the island had previously belonged to a venture capitalist and had remained relatively undeveloped, with few major amenities. Under Epstein's direction, however, Little St. James was transformed almost completely. Enormous amounts of money were poured into reshaping the land. Thousands of mature palm trees were imported to create the impression of a fully matured tropical paradise. Stone-paved roads spread across the island. The main residence, a sprawling colonial-style villa complex, was expanded to include a swimming pool, a library, and grand reception spaces overlooking sweeping ocean views. During the early years of the 21st century, the island appeared to fulfill exactly the role its image suggested. It became a destination for intellectuals, politicians, social elites, and public figures. Lifestyle and architectural publications praised the property and its atmosphere. The guest list was not anonymous. It included Nobel Prize-winning scientists, senior political figures, and members of royalty. In 2006, renowned theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking was photographed at a barbecue on the island, standing near Epstein's distinctive yellow miniature submarine. The presence of such respected academic and social figures gave the island an extraordinary aura of legitimacy. Common sense suggested that any place hosting some of the world's most admired minds, a place where conversations could range from quantum physics to cosmology to the future of biology, must surely be civilized, refined, even enlightened. Tight security, including restricted airspace and patrol boats circling the shoreline, was framed as a reasonable precaution to protect high-profile visitors. Little St. James did not inspire suspicion because of its isolation. If anything, that isolation strengthened the myth that it was a sanctuary for ideas, a place where Epstein could present himself as a modern Gatsby, a wealthy patron of science creating a secluded haven for intellectual exchange far from the noise of ordinary society. From the outside, nothing seemed obviously wrong. Private jets landed at nearby St. Thomas. Guests were ferried to the island by helicopter or luxury yacht, exactly as one would expect for an ultra-exclusive retreat. The facade was so carefully maintained that it dulled public suspicion rather than provoking it. But over time, as the glow of prestige began to fade, satellite images and distant observations exposed unsettling inconsistencies. The unease did not stem from a lack of luxury. It came from the presence of structures that made little sense on an ordinary private island. The most notorious stood at the southwestern edge of the property, isolated from the main residence. It was a strange building often referred to as the Temple, a rectangular structure painted with horizontal blue stripes that evoked the Israeli or Greek flag, yet matched no recognizable religious style. Above it rose a gleaming golden dome. More puzzling than the exterior was the entrance itself. Large, elaborately carved wooden doors that appeared impossible to use, blocked by a low iron barrier that prevented anyone from actually passing through them. Golden owl statues stood nearby, symbols that, depending on interpretation, could evoke Athena, esoteric traditions, or darker mythological associations. Everything about it felt out of place in the tropical setting. The obvious question followed. Why would an American financier of Jewish heritage, who publicly cultivated the identity of a rationalist and man of science rather than a religious devotee, build such an elaborate and symbolically loaded structure in the most remote corner of his island? If it was merely a gym, a music room, or some other mundane facility, as some early explanation suggested, then why the golden dome? Why the carved doors? Why the iconography? Satellite imagery revealed another strange feature: an enormous sundial near the center of the island, surrounded by stone benches. Its design recalled the ceremonial plazas of antiquity. Yet the scale and placement made it seem less like a private decoration and more like a visible marker, something meant to be seen from above or from neighboring St. Thomas. Meanwhile, local residents spoke of the island in terms very different from its public image. In bars along the waterfront and on the docks, people rarely referred to it simply as Little St. James. Instead, they used a darker nickname, one heavy with implication. Tour boat operators were reportedly warned not to bring visitors too close to Epstein's shoreline. They described black golf carts stationed at all hours, armed men watching from rocky outcrops, and the conspicuous lack of anything resembling normal beach leisure among many of the island's guests. That gap between public reputation and physical reality created a deeply disturbing contradiction. A resort opens outward, it embraces the sea and welcomes the horizon. But the architecture of Little St. James seemed to do the opposite. It turned inward. It appeared designed to shield, to conceal, and to control sightlines. The presence of ambiguous yet heavily symbolic structures suggested that the island had not been built for relaxation at all. It seemed to operate according to a private internal logic, one outsiders could sense, but never fully understand. And it was certainly not the logic of an ordinary seaside retreat. That vague unease gave way to direct confrontation with reality in August 2019, just 2 days after Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a major raid on Little St. James. The era of elite visitors arriving by yacht was over. Federal law enforcement had entered a domain that had been guarded and controlled for nearly 20 years. Drone footage showed FBI agents in tactical gear stepping onto the dock and moving through the island's winding roads in specialized vehicles. What they appeared to encounter was not merely scattered evidence of isolated crimes, but what looked like an entire infrastructure built to function independently of the outside world. The island was not simply a residence, it was a fortress. Investigators reportedly found an industrial-scale seawater desalination plant capable of producing enough fresh water to support hundreds of people over extended periods without depending on the mainland. High-capacity generators were said to have been buried underground and connected to a private telecommunications and internet network, allowing the island to remain fully connected while staying largely invisible to local providers. That infrastructure helped explain how activity could continue there beyond the normal awareness of territorial authorities. Data from on-site records, when cross-referenced with flight logs from the Boeing 727 registered as N908JE, widely known as the Lolita Express, began to reveal a chilling logistical pattern. The flights were not random. They followed a dense, deliberate network connecting New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and Paris to St. Thomas, where passengers were then transferred by helicopter or high-speed boat to Little St. James. And the manifests contained more than famous names. They also repeatedly listed numerous young women, many with no public profile and no social status, appearing on those flights again and again. In warehouse and maintenance areas, agents reportedly found evidence of large-scale shipments of supplies and medical equipment far beyond what a single private household would normally require. At that point, the island's true nature seemed to come into sharper focus. It resembled an operational system. It had inputs, flights bringing in young women. It had a processing structure, isolated buildings and accommodations. It had maintenance systems, independent power, water, and security. The presence of industrial-grade infrastructure on a small private island strongly suggested that what happened there was neither spontaneous nor occasional. It appeared organized, deliberate, and systematically financed to function continuously, despite the risk of exposure. And as agents and forensic teams moved further into the buildings, the last layers of concealment appeared to fall away. What emerged was more stark and more horrifying than any tabloid fantasy. Little St. James did not resemble a backdrop for glamorous excess. According to survivor testimony and legal filings, it may have functioned instead as an industrialized system of abuse. Inside the main residence and throughout the scattered bungalows, rooms were allegedly arranged in ways that stripped individuals of autonomy. The so-called massage rooms, a phrase repeated throughout survivor testimony, reportedly looked nothing like spaces in any legitimate spa. They were described as containing professional-grade massage tables, surrounded by sensitive items and instruments positioned with clinical precision. More disturbing still, some of these rooms allegedly featured locks operable only from the outside, or layouts that prevented sound from traveling beyond the walls. Survivor testimony from women, including Virginia Giuffre and Maria Farmer, became even more chilling when considered in the context of the island's physical design. They described being brought to specific rooms, having passports and mobile phones taken upon arrival, and being left with little or no meaningful recourse. The cabanas located away from the central compound were not, in those accounts, spaces of tranquil privacy. They were spaces of isolation. Each young woman could allegedly be kept apart from the others, unable to communicate, unaware of who might be nearby, and entirely dependent on Epstein's staff for food, water, movement, and permission. The so-called temple structure also attracted renewed scrutiny through the statements of former employees and outside observers. Whatever innocent explanation may once have been offered for the building, whether a music room, a gym, or something similarly benign, the path leading to it, and the atmosphere described around it, suggested something more psychologically calculated. Requiring victims to move through strange, disorienting spaces may itself have been part of a system designed to break resistance, leaving them confused, unanchored, and fully subject to the will of the man controlling the island. If the allegations are accurate, the entire mechanism operated with merciless efficiency. Young women were allegedly rotated in on a continuous basis. Some came from Eastern Europe, others came from South America, many came from within the United States. They were reportedly photographed, cataloged, and classified according to the preferences of Epstein and his associates. The island appeared to function as a hub of intake and distribution, a place where the boundary between person and property dissolved completely. There was no intimacy in such a system, no genuine consent, only coercion, sustained by a structured workforce of house managers, chefs, security personnel, and domestic staff who either looked away or actively enabled the abuse in exchange for generous pay. What shocked observers was not only the nature of the crimes, but the cold precision with which they appeared to be managed. Epstein seemed to have applied the logic of financial management and operational logistics to the exploitation of human beings, minimizing risk, controlling information, optimizing conditions, and maintaining a steady supply. If the story ended there, with Epstein as merely another wealthy and deeply depraved man, it would already be monstrous. But as investigators and journalists dug deeper into the purpose of the island, a darker and broader possibility began to emerge, one that radically changed how many people understood Epstein's relationship with the powerful men who visited him. To some investigators and commentators, Little St. James did not appear to be merely a private estate. It appeared to be part of a honeypot or compromat operation. Why would some of the most influential men in the world, from royalty to former presidents, from technology billionaires to media magnates, risk traveling to a remote island owned by a man whose name had long been surrounded by whispers and controversy? One answer may lie in the surveillance network reportedly installed across the property. Investigative sources and former employees claimed that concealed cameras and audio recording systems existed in strategic locations throughout bedrooms, massage rooms, and common spaces. In the world of intelligence and blackmail, compromising material is one of the most powerful weapons imaginable. If those reports are true, Epstein was not simply hosting powerful guests. He was collecting leverage. He was gathering secrets belonging to men whose influence reached across governments, corporations, and elite institutions. That possibility helps explain some of the most enduring mysteries of his rise: the opaque flow of money through questionable foundations and shell entities, the extraordinary level of access he enjoyed, and perhaps most notably, the astonishingly lenient plea agreement he received in Florida in 2008. Despite the gravity of the accusations against him, he was granted work release privileges that allowed him to leave custody for 12 hours a day. To many observers, the justice system did not merely seem bent by wealth. It appeared warped by fear. Fear of what Epstein might have known, what he might have stored, and what he might have been capable of exposing. In that light, the island's isolation looked less like luxury and more like strategy. Neither victims nor powerful visitors could easily escape its reach. Once they stepped onto its shores, they may have become part of a shadow archive. And as the full scope of that alleged blackmail operation seemed to edge closer to public exposure, a series of abrupt and deeply troubling developments followed. Developments that, to many, suggested a brutal act of institutional self-preservation. Epstein's death in custody in August 2019, officially ruled a suicide despite glaring failures in custodial oversight, permanently silenced the single most important witness in the case. But that was only the first disappearance. Subsequent releases of court records, including major disclosures made in the name of transparency, produced vast quantities of material while still leaving behind a powerful sense of absence. Many names remained redacted. Portions of video and physical evidence allegedly recovered from the island were never shown to the public. Hard drives, compact discs, and recorded footage that witnesses said had once existed in Epstein's possession seemed, at least in the public imagination, to disappear into a void of unanswered questions. Then the island itself began to change. In 2023, billionaire investor Stephen Dekoff purchased Little St. James and neighboring Great St. James for $60 million, announcing plans to transform the property into a world-class luxury resort. Soon afterward, bulldozers and cranes arrived. Structures associated with the crimes, including some of the most controversial buildings and the quarters where victims were allegedly confined, were demolished or altered so drastically that they became almost unrecognizable. The destruction of those physical traces carried its own disturbing symbolism. It resembled the leveling of a crime scene before historians, investigators, or the public could fully document what had happened there. Evidence of possible tunnel systems, hidden rooms, and surveillance infrastructure risked being buried beneath new concrete and five-star development. Seen that way, the transfer of ownership and the rapid redevelopment represented more than a business transaction. To many, it looked like an attempt to overwrite collective memory. And that is where the public remains, suspended in a state of unresolved unease. We know crimes occurred. We know girls and young women were abused. Yet the full scope of what happened, the complete roster of those involved, and the whereabouts of whatever data Epstein may have amassed remain fragmented, obscured, and incomplete. Those who may have appeared in his recordings often seem, even now, protected from accountability. The island may one day recover its beauty, but its innocence is gone forever. Today, when people look toward Little St. James, they no longer see the island that once existed in whispers and fear. They see a construction site promising renewal, a place where future guests may once again arrive to sunbathe, swim, and enjoy the same turquoise water that once concealed so much horror. But for those who understand what the island represents, it stands as an invisible monument to the collapse of moral courage. The explanation for how such a place operated openly for 20 years cannot rest on Jeffrey Epstein alone. He was one man operating within a much larger system. The island endured because a global structure allowed it to endure, a structure in which the desires, influence, and leverage of the ultra-wealthy could be elevated above law, truth, and human dignity. Little St. James became the physical embodiment of a moral vacuum, a place where money seemed capable of buying silence, secrecy, and near total immunity. Its real legacy is not found in the buildings that once stood there, or in those that have now been torn down. Its legacy lies in the dread it leaves behind. It demonstrated that, with enough money and enough influence, a private hell could be built inside a tropical paradise, while the world chose not to look too closely. Epstein is gone. But the model he appeared to use, exploiting human vulnerability in order to manipulate, compromise, and control power, did not die with him. And that leaves behind the most disturbing questions of all. Where is the data he may have amassed? Who has it now? And how many other places like Little St. James still operate elsewhere in the world, hidden beneath more elegant names, serving different masters, and protected by the same silence? The waves still wash over the island's white sand. They erase footprints, but they cannot erase truth. Darkness does not disappear. It adapts, it becomes quieter, and it hides itself more deeply than before.